All right, we are almost there. On to part 3 for our last timeline in this series of first timelines. Since we ended at 65 million years, we cannot place a zoom in timeline below. What we can do is begin an entirely new timeline with a new scale and a new time span, which will go from 6 million years ago to 500,000 years ago. By now, you likely know the math. Six million years minus 500,000 years will give us, you can put it in your calculator, 5,500,000 years. Of course, I want to divide that by 11 inches, which will give me my final scale. $5.5 million divided by 11 inches equals 500,000. Great. Years per inch. So now I will begin the process again. This time you can measure from the bottom, and let's go with about 2.5 inches from the bottom of the page. And we will connect those with our ruler and draw our last timeline. First things first, you guessed it, our arrows, which are important because they indicate to our audience that time continues to move forward and has continued to go into the past. Our first order of business is, of course, to make our hash marks at each inch. For this series of timelines, every hash mark should line up just about on the same spot. They should be nearly perfect if you're using a ruler. And so begins the tedious task of placing our years at each hash mark. We begin with 6 million years ago, and move into 5.5 million years ago. Finally, 5 million years ago. 4.5 million years ago. 4 million years ago, and so forth. Again, we should end on the far right with our last date in the time span, which is 500,000 years ago. Now, we simply fit in our last 4 events. This hash mark translates or converts into an event indicator. First, hominids. In Africa. Then I need to look for 1.8 million years ago, which will be right around 2 million. Homo erectus migrates out of Africa. Just on the other side of 1.5 million years, we have 1.4 million when the event of evidence of hominids using fire in Africa. And finally, 500,000 years ago, when the first Neanderthals this is why we do a rough draft. Now when I transfer this paper to my final draft, I will know I need more space to finish that word. However, when it's a rough draft, I'm not going to worry too much about this mistake. Appear in Europe. You could have also chosen that hominids began using fire in China. So now I have all 3 timelines labeled and almost ready to go. What you will do at this moment is erase each of the dates which you'll see in black along the hash marks. Earlier in our timeline, we labeled the dates with each event. Those we must include. So if we go back and see that we have forgotten some, then we need to include them. This is okay. If I don't have the date for first multicelled organisms, I look at my list, first multicelled organisms 1.5 billion years ago, and I write 1.5 billion years ago. I will do the same for each event, and then I must erase all of the hash marks, both the dates and the hash mark itself. Once I do this, my paper will look fresh and neat. Okay, just another time to emphasize that we want to erase every one of these hash marks. Remember, our event indicators are going to be all that's left. Each of these hash marks will be gone from our final draft. So you can go through and erase each of these hash marks and any other mistakes you've made so that you are only left with the timeline and each event indicator and label. Okay? Now your sheet should look very similar to this one here. You may have erase marks throughout your line, but that's okay. This is simply a rough draft. And for our final two features, we know that a map requires one, a title, you can also come up with a different and creative title on your own, that's fine. And two, a legend or key. Since I have room here in the bottom left-hand corner, that's where I will make my legend. Again, I probably want to be fairly particular. I have just about 2 inches available. And I'm going to go just below 2 inches. There we go. You can choose whatever dimensions you want. All that I ask is that you please do your best to keep your line nice and neat. You may also use a completely different color for the box on your legend in order to avoid any confusion. So I will want to list a number of details. For one, I'm going to need to label each of my lines, and two, I'm going to need my scale for each of my lines. You will want to be sure and retrieve your spare paper where you have completed the math for each of your scales. Now, since the top two timelines are connected, as you remember, we made our zoom in bracket there, and the bottom timeline is its own separate timeline, we will imply this to our reader by labeling the top timeline 1A, the middle timeline 1B, and then our final timeline is new, therefore labeled 2. The scale for line 1A was 1,245,409,090 years per inch. The scale for line 1B was 175,909,090 years per inch. And finally, the scale for line 2, which is our third line, was 500,000 years per inch. You may choose to label these scales in your legend however you wish, but what I do want to make sure of is that you do so very clearly. Anyone who reads your timeline should be able to understand exactly what you mean based on your scale. A good way to figure that out is provide the timeline to a friend or family member, and without providing them any information, ask them if they understand your timeline without any questions. Finally, as you can see, we have our title, we have our scale and our legend, and since this is not a geographic map, we don't have a compass, but our arrows are almost similar in providing the information of which direction time is going, and in this case, when time began over 13 billion years ago. Once you have completed your rough draft, you can simply take a blank piece of computer paper and rewrite this rough draft as neatly as possible. Ideally, you have no eraser marks, smudges, inaccurate lines, curved lines, or other untidy appearances. Great job, guys. You did it.